Hello, my name is Seamus Hickey, and this is my report. My team and I collaborated on Moonsweeper, a first-person action-adventure game in which you play an astronaut fighting off hordes of giant insects on the moon, using only your bug spray and jetpack. My role on the team was as concept artist, 3D modeler and animator, the first step being to design the characters for this game. I produced all the art for the game using my Wacom tablet and Adobe Photoshop CS6. It had been decided early on that we were going to base our main character on Chris Hadfield, an astronaut who had made the news in 2013 covering David Bowie's Space Oddity while in orbit, so I knew we were giving him a mustache. In designing his suit, I first researched a few different styles from real-world spacesuits to science fiction cinema. We thought a kind of jumpsuit would work better than the full astronaut's helmet and clunky gloves approach, and it made more sense since the character spends the entire game inside the moon base. I approached the jetpack and spray gun with the same logic, make it compact and manageable, and went through a few incarnations before deciding on the final design for the character. For a while he carried a kind of laser fly swatter as a melee weapon, but the idea was later dropped. The all-blue colour scheme of his jumpsuit was chosen to emphasise the character's status as a kind of space janitor, work clothes, plain and ordinary. Next, I moved on to the enemies in the game, the insects. We had decided that there would be two types of crawling insect and one flying one, and that they would be larger than normal. I sketched up a few pieces on paper before working up the best concepts in Photoshop. Once I had some core concepts down, I was ready to start modelling the first insect. I started out by creating a box with 3 height, 3 length and 3 width segments. Next, I converted the box to editable poly and began shaping the insect. I extruded and beveled polygons to create the head and legs for the right side of the bug. I refined the mesh by subdividing, creating more polygons where detail was needed, and adding the eyes and palps to the head, and rounding the legs. Next, I applied the symmetry modifier and collapsed the 2 halves into one model before moving on to the texturing process. I applied the Unwrap UV modifier to the mesh and selected Edge Mode. I drew the seams where the texture would be cut and opened it in the Unwrap UV window. I set the Unwrap helper under the Pick Texture header and activated Display Texture in Viewport. Next, I entered Peel mode and rotated, stretched and pulled the mesh until the Unwrap helper texture was displayed on the mesh without distortion and all the numbers were legible. I rendered this UV template out to Photoshop and textured the piece, taking pieces from different insect photos and warping them into place, and clone stamping areas that needed to be filled. I added an overlay layer and tweaked the color balance and levels until I was happy with it. To rig the character for animation, I used the Character Animation Toolkit, or CAT for short, in 3D Studio Max. I started by creating a pelvis bone in the body, shaping it to fit the body as well as possible. From the pelvis, I created 6 legs with 3 cat bones each, and from there I created a spine and skull bone. Once the rig was completed and fit correctly, I added the skin modifier to the mesh and added all bones. I entered Edit Envelopes mode and set how much of the model is affected by each of the bones using the Weight tool. Once I had tested the rig and saw there were no visible distortions when I moved the limbs and head, the character was ready for animation. I also modeled and rigged our level boss, a giant 2-tailed scorpion which was based on a concept drawing by our other artist, Oisin Mansell, who also created the UV texture map for this model. For all the animation of these characters, I used the Character Animation Toolkit. Using the cat animation layering system, you can create a working walk cycle for any creature with any number of limbs automatically and easily, and with a huge amount of control over the movements and speed. This walking animation is put onto a cat motion layer, and any movements you animate where the character is standing still are created on a separate layer. Since I needed my characters to have a walk, fight and die animation, I put the walk cycle on the cat motion layer and the fighting and dying animations on an absolute layer. Once I was happy with the timing and movement, I exported the model, rig and animation as an FBX for use in the game. I was also responsible for rigging and animating the flying bugs created by project manager Ed Griffith, which I again achieved using CAT. As well as this, I was tasked with modeling and texturing the lab area of the moon base. I box modeled a lab table, a radiation glove box, and a circular set of scopes. I used Unwrap UV as before, but instead of using peel mode, I flattened the map and stitched the pieces together into individual elements so they could be textured easily. Then I rendered out the UV template and created the textures in Photoshop. For the walls, floor and ceiling of the lab, I sourced free metal and tile textures online. Finally, I imported my creatures and environment work into our Unity game level, ready for scripting.